Let's be clear. Oil companies brought in $200 billion in profit last year, while high energy prices meant that many families struggled to keep food on the table. Companies are profiting off of a volatile global market by pushing domestic prices higher, while communities here at home continue to suffer from the impacts of oil and gas development. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call an oil cartel. Today's hearing is an opportunity to examine the federal offshore oil and gas program. The urgency to address federal fossil fuel development is undeniable as we endure the 6th straight week of record-breaking heat waves from Arizona to New York City. As it stands, the United States is the world's #1 producer of oil and gas and the 2nd highest emitter of greenhouse gas pollution. Our public lands and waters contribute nearly a quarter to those emissions. As the federal government, we have an obligation to make our public lands part of the solution to the climate crisis rather than the problem. The Outer Continental Shelf Act, which allows the federal government to lease lands in our federal waters, was passed to secure national energy security. With the support of federal agencies like the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy, our nation has pioneered offshore technologies that set the global standard. But the current arguments characterizing energy independence lose credibility when you discover that the United States is currently exporting 50% more oil and gas than we did in 2019, all while prices we see at the pump here at home and on our utility bills remain high. These companies operate with light oversight and almost total disregard for the substantial pollution they cause, their climate impacts, and the neighboring communities that have become sacrifice zones. So whose security is really at stake here? Let's get into what it could look like to protect our workers. To date, offshore drilling companies have amassed thousands of leases covering more than 11 million acres of federal waters. A staggering 74% of these leases have never produced oil or gas. 9 million acres remain leased but inactive. Despite these massive holdings, these companies continue to seek more. Companies will claim they are creating new jobs, but these claims fall flat as we witness the oil and gas industry systematically automate, shedding its workforce, leaving fuel workers with declining wages and uncertain futures as CEOs take in million-dollar bonuses. Between 2008 and 2019, offshore oil production in the federal waters off Louisiana increased by 44%, while direct employment in the industry crashed by 62%. A 2020 survey of offshore workers in the Gulf revealed that nearly 50% had been laid off at least once, and 15% reported being laid off more than once. We are producing more oil and gas than ever with fewer and fewer people. For generations, workers in the Gulf of Mexico have risked life and limb to sustain our way of life. But now it's time to build upon that legacy and look towards the future. We owe American workers energy stability and protection, not hollow promises. So I ask again, as our communities lose jobs to volatile oil companies, whose security is really at stake when we talk about energy security and independence? And let's get into what it would look like to protect frontline communities. Gulf Coast communities bear the brunt of these impacts, economic and environmental. These communities experience the booms and busts of a volatile industry. Oil spills degrade fishing grounds and threaten coastal livelihoods. Pipeline canals and petroleum withdrawal have decimated the iconic boot of southern Louisiana. The release of toxic pollutants from industry leads to respiratory illnesses, disease, and higher rates of cancer. A 2001 study discovered that more than 80% of residents of Port Arthur, Texas, the predominantly Black West Side, suffered heart and lung ailments. Oil and gas infrastructure also destroys habitat and disrupts migratory patterns, endangering local biodiversity. Indigenous communities and low-income neighborhoods, which are more often closer to this infrastructure, suffer significant losses in cultural heritage and subsistence resources. Rather than maintaining the status quo and propping up the fossil fuel industry, let's invest in the cleanup of the thousands of miles of abandoned pipelines and countless abandoned wells and rigs to create jobs and protect the environment. The Interior Department's recently proposed regulations to hold companies better accountable with stronger financial assurances for cleanup of used wells is a step in the right direction. Last Congress, we signed into law historic investments in climate and clean energy, including long overdue reforms to offshore oil and gas programs and essential investments in renewable energy to further the transition through the Inflation Reduction Act. But that legislation also included a deal to tie future renewable energy to leasing to oil and gas leasing for the next 10 years. This provision forces us to choose continued burdens for environmental justice communities or renewable energy development to fight the climate crisis, a choice that we should not be forced to make. It's time we right that wrong and advance renewable energy without forced ties to fossil fuels. Yesterday, I introduced the Non-Restrictive Offshore Wind Act, or the NOW Act, to repeal that tie and pave the way for clean, union-led offshore wind industry. The stakes are high, the health of the planet and the well-being of the workforce and future generations hang in the balance. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back to the chair.